Welcome to biology. Today, we are going to be talking about populations and really looking at the way we describe a population and how they're distributed and so forth, and where we can find the species within that population. But then also looking at factors that are going to impact population size in a negative way or possibly a positive way. So. Um, Going ahead, I really again recommend that we are taking notes, that we're practicing taking notes, so that you have all this information in one spot. Um, Again, it is a great habit and skill to be able to process information, summarize information in your own words, and then be able to utilize that information later, especially as you prepare for a career or education after high school. So again, I know it's a little different right now, but I highly recommend it based on here. So recommended notes. Here we go. Um, so first, focusing on the characteristics of a population and how we describe a population. And again, just with what is a population, we're really talking about a species. So organisms that are all the same, like humans, for example, or you know, Pacific Northwest finches or something like that. Okay, so any species, but a specific species, and then we have ways that we can look at that species and talk about them. And so here we are with the first one is range. So when you're looking at a species and the population, one of the first questions that you want to be aware of is what is the range of that species, and really, hopefully it's not too complicated, but it's the specific region where we find that population, that species. And so I put an example down here. You can blow this up if you want, but so this would be for the Western toad. And you got the formal names and so forth. And they even compare it to a subspecies with the Californian toad. Uh, but the Western toad would be this entire west coast, and you can see it in the highlighted areas. And so it's interesting that there's some spots without the toad. Okay, and so there's reasons for that. Usually it's geographical, and so there's no habitats and where they're going to be found. Um, so that's something to keep in mind. But this is the general range, and so it would not be expected to see the western toad on the east coast. And uh, generally speaking, this is important to understand as you start looking at things like invasive species and species that continue to expand their range and then increase the competition for certain species. And oftentimes, if they are invasive, then they're also destroying the fitness of those species that are already there. So by tracking this for the different species, we can kind of keep an eye on that and monitor that. For an example, though, the blackberry bushes. I would imagine most of you have experience with a blackberry bush. They are highly invasive, and they're highly powerful in the way that they take over a landscape. So if you're trying to preserve a certain region, it's really important that you don't introduce blackberry seeds and the blackberry bush in general, because it will start to overpopulate and take over the areas where it's found. Um, so that's just an example again of why we might track the range of a population. Then there's distribution. So within this range, you can look at how the population is actually distributed. And so, what that's referring to, I have got this statement here: population density gives the average number of individuals per unit area or volume. So, really, it's talking about, do they group together? Do they spread out? And is there some organization to how they spread out? So, I'll talk about a couple examples, but I got this visual here for us as well. So again, population distribution describes how the individuals are distributed or spread out through their habitat or throughout their habitat, which would be considered that range. Okay, so looking at this, I know it's a little bit blurry, but I really liked how it had the visual, but then also the little descriptions to help you understand it. So uh, the most common that you're going to find is that organisms are clumped together in what are called clusters. So and different species will have different cluster names like a herd or a pack and so forth. Um, but so this is really that they will work together and have little communities within the range that they're spread out in. But they're the same species, right? Or there's more random and unpredictable distribution. And as it says here, this is typical of a species with individuals that do not interact strongly. So they're really not looking to benefit from one another. They're not looking to necessarily harm one another. So they just kind of do their own thing. And then there's uniform distribution where organisms are evenly spaced out through the area. And this is typical of species in which individuals compete for a scarce environmental resource such as water or a desert. I want to say an example of this is something like the mountain lion. So mountain lions don't really travel in packs like a wolf, and so for them, it's really important that they have their own kind of territory and that they're not too close. And so that might look like 10 square miles. Okay, just kind of putting out a number there. For 10 square miles, they're going to continue to hunt and sleep and kind of stay within their area. And if they find that another mountain lion comes into their 10 square miles, they can smell it, they can sense it, they can see evidence of it, and it can become very territorial, and they'll look to compete for that area. So to avoid the competition, they will look for their own spot, and it tends to be a uniform distribution. Then there's the age sex structure, and this is really looking at the kind of the makeup of the population and what does the overall population look like as far as male and female, but also like numbers by age. And so looking at this, again, feel free to read these and summarize it in your notes. But this diagram is really the most important part to really understand. And so what this is showing, the longer the bar, the higher the percentage. And at the bottom here is also going to be younger, right? So age is going up. So as you get older, the age is going up. And the length of these bars is your survival. And so really this first bar is birth. So at birth, that's how many are going to survive. And for the sake of talking about it, it could be 100% of the offspring survive initially. Then maybe after the first year or two, you find that not the entire population is still alive. There are some deaths. And then maybe 4 or 5 years, and 6 to 7 years, and 10 years, and 20 years, and 30 years, and 40, and so forth. So depending on what species you're looking at, these are going to be labeled on what the categories are. But generally speaking, they're never going to be as long as they are at the childbirth here. And so you're going to see this continue to go up. And so really individuals as they get older are dying off quicker and so forth. And there's a regular pattern of fewer and fewer individuals at the older age group surviving. And then you can also compare male and female. And that's really important as you can see, which gender has a higher likelihood of survival. But you can also look at, if this starts to get skewed within a population, so let's say, for example, all of a sudden there's more males and only a few females. Well, that's going to change the mating practices. That's going to change the competition for reproduction. And it could, depending on how severe it keeps going, lead to the downfall of the species. So it's really important that these are more or less balanced for reproductive success for the species. And that brings us to survivorship curves. So really, another way to look at population and population change and so forth is what are the curves for survivorship, and really this is a comparison of the birth rate compared to the death rate. And so you're going to see really three patterns. And so we have type 1 here, where you have a very low death rate and high survivorship. So a lot of the individuals survive until they get to old age, and then they die. Or you have type 2, where it's very much down the middle. And so age may not be a perfect indicator of whether or not they're going to survive. So again, like with this one, if I'm looking at age, if they're younger, they're pretty much going to survive. That is pretty much going to be true. Now, this won't be perfect in a real sample, but this is the trend you'll see. And then this, it's pretty much 50-50 whether or not they're surviving, but then it continues to go down equally as they get older. And then type 3 here, you have a lot of births and very sudden deaths, and only a few of the population actually continue to survive and maybe make it to old age. So three different types, and this can happen within species. And different species will also have different patterns if you compare each other. But I want to be clear, this can happen within the same species based on kind of the area that they're in, or their territory, their habitat. Then we have kind of looking at the opposite side, and growth of population. So there's really two types. One is going to be exponential growth, and this is what's going to happen under ideal conditions. So they have plenty of resources, they have plenty of shelter, food, that kind of stuff, and mates as well. That's important. And so what this means, really, I like this statement here, is the population, will have however many births, but then the next generation, you have all of those offspring having more offspring and more offspring and more. So it just continues to grow. And so as the population size increases, the rate in which it increases keeps going faster and faster. So it's going to grow more and more. And then again, this happens until something happens, and you have this carrying capacity here. So that brings us to logistic growth, where most populations do not live under ideal conditions. And let me, before I forget, curve A. So this is that exponential where it's going to keep going. But then logistic growth is what happens really to any species, because what we'll see is most organisms do not grow exponentially, but they might start off with exponential growth. Excuse me. So as the population is newly rising, newly taking on a new area, something like that, they might find an abundance of resources, and so they will start to have exponential population growth. But then, as the populations start to get too close to the carrying capacity, as they start to run out of food or other resources, or if some sort of event occurs that's going to limit the population, you'll see that the curve will start to straighten out and stabilize around the carrying capacity. And I want to be clear, though. So while this doesn't show it and it doesn't specifically say it, what you'll see is that when there becomes an abundance of resources, your population growth will continue to go over the carrying capacity. And then as you're over the carrying capacity, what that means is, well, now you have too many individuals and the habitat can't provide for it, or there's too much competition. And so the reproduction will happen, and then more individuals will die because there's not enough resources, and then also become below the line. And so you'll actually see it. I'll kind of zoom in. You'll actually see this logistic growth once it gets to carrying capacity, kind of go up and down until the species goes extinct and so forth. Okay, so good. Now, looking at this, I kind of just touched on it. There's a few factors that are going to be limiting to population growth, and they're very important and they're very present, right? So there's only a few that we really are going to focus on, but they can wipe an entire species out. So they're kind of big. So the first category is what's called density dependent. So if you're thinking about density of a population, it's like how many individuals are in a certain area. That's the density. And so really you're looking at the population size will eventually be limited as the population grows past the carrying capacity. So that's what I was just talking about. And when a population is past the carrying capacity of its environment, that's overpopulation. You might have heard that term before. We tend to talk about it as overpopulation with humans. But it's true for all species and organisms. So, and then resources become more limited. So that's something to keep in mind, that this is what we're talking about. As the population grows, these things are going to happen. And so competition, we've talked about it before now with part of our relationships between organisms. And so as you have more and more population, then there's more competition for resources. And also with humans, while we're actively creating more resources, we're farming, different things like that, we're trying to reduce competition for resources. It kind of shows itself in other ways. And so a war would be an example of a type of competition that is going to limit the worldwide population. So, kind of connecting the biology and the ecology to almost history, we see this pattern throughout history. Okay, so when we start talking about human history, though, we have another class for it because there are so many details we could talk about. But this is a concept of basic biology and animal interaction. Then there's predator-prey relationships. Again, we've already talked about that, so I don't want to spend too much time. But as your population increases, you're going to have either more predators or you're going to have more prey or both, and therefore you're going to see more death. Okay, and so there's more competition within that as well. You're also going to have more likelihood of parasitism. And really disease. And so, again, parasitism is it's negative for one and beneficial for the other. And so things like bacteria are living organisms, and they thrive off of animals in particular, but also plants. Plants can have disease. They thrive on their death. And so as populations increase, it opens the door for more disease. Then there's overcrowding stress. And so this one is really, when you're looking at a specific population like that western toad, okay, you might be in northern Oregon looking at the western toad. And if it becomes overcrowded in northern Oregon, then you might see that there's a migration towards eastern Oregon. Or towards Washington. And so that then limits the population within there. So this one is a little more isolated to parts of the species within the range. Next, we have density independent factors. And so basically this is saying it doesn't matter if you're overpopulated or not, these are going to hit you. And so population size can also be limited, not related to overpopulation, and they can really lead to, of course, a decrease in population size, but your entire species going extinct as well. And it depends on your species and how big the event is. But a couple examples: natural disaster. And so, of course, natural disasters, I mean, we just had a snowstorm. That could be considered a natural disaster, and it could have killed many organisms right through that. And then, tsunamis, hurricanes, you get the idea, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, big natural disasters can be devastating. So if you have a unique species within a specific area, and there's a big event that occurs, then that entire species could be wiped out. Um, but then I also wanted to just make note that this could include something like a drought. Okay, so a natural disaster could be like a big event that happens suddenly, but it could be that a certain area doesn't get water, right? Doesn't get rainfall for time and time and time, and then now a desert forms, and so we've seen that, and really from our research, all of the major deserts that we have on this planet used to be some form of tropical or jungle like biome, and then as a drought occurs, as mountain ranges grow, it changes how rainfall is able to hit a certain area, and then eventually all of the species that were within that jungle, so to speak, go extinct, and then only a few species that then are able to thrive within a desert, for example, uh, survive, or move into that area. Uh, so drought is definitely a big part that can change it, but that usually takes longer periods of time. And last but not least at all is the human activity. And so this is something that is arguably the largest extinct. Well, it's really not arguable. It's a statistical fact right now. But human activity is one of the largest extinction events in our world history. And so when we look at extinction events, you know, the big one everyone thinks about is the dinosaurs. Okay, big meteor hit the Gulf of Mexico, boom, and it actually took millions of years, but the dinosaurs eventually went extinct due to that event, and so, or due to a series of events, kind of that cascaded from that. But the point is, um, that's an example of an extinction event, and throughout our history, we have these really massive extinction events that we can see in fossil records, where suddenly, when you're looking at layers of the earth and you're doing some carbon dating, all of a sudden that a type of fossil is no longer found, and then new fossils are found, and so then it's like, okay, well, there must have been an event, and then so going back to human activity. We arguably, as we build homes, as we cut down forests, as we start using resources from the earth, like drilling for oil and different things like that, we are constantly really making species go extinct. And so while it feels like, oh, well, we have hundreds of millions of different species and biodiversity, we are killing thousands of species every day is what the data is showing. So the rate in which we are destroying entire species is that equal to, if not greater than what we picture with the dinosaurs. So a lot of people don't necessarily think about it, but it is a big part of biodiversity and population limitations for species. So that is really the notes for today, and I've talked through it as much as I could to help you have an understanding of it. And that leads to a couple questions. And so really these are checking for understanding, and I want to just highlight so you have an understanding of what I'm asking for. But so first, how might the range and distribution pattern of a given species impact the fitness of a species? And so again, what I'm talking about, when you're looking at the population distribution and the range, how might that impact the fitness, the likelihood of survival? And so I kind of put a hint in here for you. If you think of a species with a very small range, so let's say if you've heard of the Galapagos Islands, They're in the Galapagos. They are just northeast, no, northwest, sorry, of Ecuador, and they're technically well, owned by Ecuador, if you will. But the Galapagos Islands are known historically for where evolution was discovered. And so they have preserved those islands better than any other island habitat that we really can experience. And so those organisms, there's, Galapagos iguanas. Okay, they're only found in the Galapagos. There's Galapagos white-tip shark. There's literally hundreds of species that are Galapagos something because they're only found there. So if there was a catastrophic event, like a natural disaster, on top of the Galapagos Islands, what would the survival of those species look like? Could they be wiped out all in one little event? Because the Galapagos Islands is kind of small when you think about the whole world, right? Compare that to a population that is widely distributed. You might find it in North America, South America, you might find it in Africa. And so if they're widely distributed, would a single event wipe them out? Okay, or what would the fitness overall look like? So compare those two and have that discussion about how the overall fitness might be impacted. Next, I wanted us to look at real life examples of this age-sex structure chart. And so we had this kind of perfect one in our notes. And so looking at this, we have population A, population B, and I took these are actually two different countries. Okay, so I want to tell you that, but I took the countries out of them because I didn't want it to be about like, oh, which country is better or that kind of thing. But really, we can see how the populations are different, right? Hopefully you see that these are two very different shapes. And so we can interpret that and go, well, what does this mean about where these populations are from? What questions can we ask about their environment or their habitat that leads to these differences? And so with that, okay, can we just generally describe what I was kind of talking about? What is the overall shape? So compare and contrast. Well, population A makes more of a pyramid. Population B makes more of like an hourglass. Okay, so you're just describing the shape. Percentage of population under 20. So that's about here. I might say, okay, the majority of the population is what I'm seeing is 20 and younger in population A. In population B, it looks a little bit different where it's a little more evenly spread out. Percentage of 60 and above. So 60 and above. This is pretty small. And this is a little bit, well, I would say significantly bigger than this over here, right? So compare the two, go back and forth on how you talk about it. And you can also think about the male-female balance. And with that, I would highlight the top here. Population B, you can see that females survive better at the older age than the males within this population. But in this population, it's almost equal throughout the whole thing, as far as I can tell. Okay, so you're comparing and contrasting, just to get an idea of what is this graph telling me. Now, which one has a better life expectancy? So I want you to pull out, well, what does this tell me? So better life expectancy, I'm going to let you try to figure that out based on that chart. And then for, as I've stated now, what can we learn about the fitness of the organism population A compared to population B? So again, survival. What does it mean if the top of the chart is very small and the top of the chart is kind of small but wider, right? So, what does that mean about survival? What conclusions can we make about the environment? Which country, so I stated that this was a country, which country might you prefer to live in? So you're trying to, can we draw conclusions about the environment they live in? Might one be safer? Might one have more resources? These kind of questions about the environment might lead to better survivorship, which is why you see it in the chart. So with that then, any questions you still have after looking at that data? because it doesn't tell you everything, but it can definitely prompt some questions. Next, we're looking at the survivorship curves for 5 and 6. So if I'm looking at the survivorship curves here, which survivorship curve represents a K strategist, which I believe is question 5, and then which survivorship curve represents the R strategist? And for this, I really want you to keep in mind and think about what we learned from our reproductive strategies assignment. So hopefully maybe you took notes, or you can go back and open it up if you need to review it. But a K strategist or an R strategist for type 1, type 2, or type 3. Okay, so again, that's 5 and 6. Yes. And last couple questions. Looking at the logistic growth of populations, being by far the most common, in the notes stated the population size stabilizes at carrying capacity. And I mentioned this, the notes didn't mention it, but I talked about it. We also know that the most population sizes do not remain constant. Can you explain to me why population sizes can fluctuate using the following terms? I want you to try and refer to carrying capacity, density dependent, and density independent. And really those are our limiting population growth events. Okay? And that brings us to 8. And so for this one, I really, I want to put it out there. If this is a sensitive topic for you, I really don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable, and I apologize ahead of time. But I feel like it's important to reflect on it. And so the prompt of this is a reflection, and really looking at our current state of the world right now. And there's lots of different ways to look at this, but as we look at COVID-19 and this global pandemic, okay, so that's what we're talking about. We're experiencing an unprecedented global pandemic in our modern society. And unfortunately, this is a very real and personal example of a density-dependent, population-limiting event of disease, right? We talked about that with the limiting of population size. So with that, again, personally, I have lost loved ones to COVID-19 already, and so I know it can be it can impact others differently to think about this. So if this is something that you're not comfortable thinking about, then please let me know, and I will kind of take this problem away. But if you're able to, then I really would encourage you to think about this, because as I've stated here, this is not the first time that a disease has devastated the human population on a global scale. And so I've recorded below some of the most severe diseases recorded in our history of the entire world. Now, there were some earlier, that were like BC and that kind of thing. So very, very long ago. But there's only a few, and none of them had the numbers of death that these ones did. So when I was researching this, I focused on ones that really had unbelievable numbers, and kind of very, very painful numbers to look at. But I really wanted to look at the dates. Okay, we're not going to research all of this, but we're looking at the dates and knowing that these impacted the entire globe. There's patterns that we can reflect on. So first, what do you notice about the dates of these pandemics? Okay, so I'm looking at, okay, this was 11th century. This was 1350, 1870, 1889, 1918, 1957, 1981. So looking at that, okay, we have two major pandemics right here within 19 years of each other, starting in the 1800s, late 1800s. Then through the 1900s, you have uh, three major pandemics, and they're a little spread out, but also within 20 to 30 years of each other. And so when you're looking at this pattern, really from 1870 through today, there's been a major pandemic almost every 20 years, give or take a few years. And so this is a pattern that, and again, these are the ones that were most devastating in world history, and they're all clumped here. You might think, okay, there'd be a few back here that would devastate a large population, but like I said, there's only a couple, and there are centuries between them. 11th century and the 1350s. That's 250 years at least between these. And now all of a sudden, these are 20 years apart, and they're each more devastating than these previous ones. So, I kind of just answered this one. What do we notice about the dates of these? These are all really close together and really recent. So, thinking about that, what factors might be leading to an increase in severity and increase in frequency of these new diseases? And I mentioned here as well, some of them are still ongoing. They're not away, they're not gone. And so thinking about that as well, then what might we be able to do? Is there anything we can do? Can we prevent these catastrophic events? Or is this something that we should become more familiar with? Just culturally speaking, we look at other cultures and they've responded differently. And I'm not going to say better or worse, but differently to this pandemic than we have here in the United States. And even in the United States, we have different, regions of our country that have responded differently to this one. And so, when we look at that, is there something we might want to be thinking about? Would it be fair to predict that there might be another one within 20 years, which is all of our lifetime, hopefully? So it's very interesting. And then, so for me personally, I lived through this SARS one, and I have no recollection of it. I don't remember really seeing it on the news, and I was, a younger child. But, of course, this one has really impacted me. And it feels like it's impacted our society far more than this previous one did. And I do know part of that's graphically or geographically, it impacted other regions harder than us. But so is there a lesson to be learned, and is there something we can do? Again, there's not going to be a right or wrong answer for this question, but I do think it's really important for us to recognize that these topics that we're talking about with ecology don't just pertain to species and organisms that like a rabbit or a toad, but they pertain to us. We are a species. We are an animal, a mammal. We have to live by the same rules that the rest of these organisms do. So when we think about the importance of, why are we learning about ecology? This is boring. Maybe you might be saying, I don't know. We're really trying to learn more about how we can survive and what factors are going to be important for our survival. We talked about primary producers in our previous activity, the importance of a primary producer. And many of you said, if we lose that primary producer, then the entire food chain or food web could be devastated, if not destroyed. We are a part of that food web. So where do we think our efforts should be when trying to protect the sea algae? Right? It sounds silly, and you might hear a lot of people go, "Oh, it doesn't matter; it's whatever." But if we're learning that primary producers are the keystone to really all life, and we don't protect the primary producers, well, what's going to be the result? And now I'm getting off topic, but the point I wanted to make is this is all stuff that impacts us. And so I hope you see that and can start making connections with that. And thank you for reflecting with this. And again, not a right or wrong answer. Please let me know if you're not comfortable though, so I know why you didn't answer it if you choose not to. All right. That being said, thank you for your time. Thank you for participating, and please let me know if you have any